Story 1. The slowest heist in Scandinavian history. You are about to hear a story of a crime that unfolded at a pace so unusual, it hardly seemed like a crime at all. This is not the tale of masked men bursting through doors with weapons drawn, or of dramatic chases through the streets of Stockholm. Instead, it is the story of a heist that was so gradual, so drawn out, that those who later studied it often wondered whether the perpetrators wanted to get caught or whether their patience was, in fact, their greatest weapon. To understand this heist, you need to imagine Scandinavia in the late 20th century, a place of apparent quiet and order, where crime rates were often lower than in many other parts of Europe, and where a deep cultural trust meant that businesses and institutions sometimes operated with fewer security measures than you might expect today. And in that atmosphere of trust, a group of individuals found an opportunity. They did not rush. They did not storm into a building in the dead of night. Instead, they took years to pull off what would later be called the slowest heist in Scandinavian history. Setting the stage, Scandinavia in transition. The early 1980s were a transitional period in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Oil wealth had transformed Norway's economy, Sweden's welfare state was being tested by global recession, and Denmark was wrestling with inflation and political uncertainty. Through it all, the Scandinavian sense of social cohesion remained strong. Crime existed, of course, but it often lacked the scale or spectacle of organized operations elsewhere. Banks were secure but not impregnable. Libraries and museums kept treasures, but sometimes in surprisingly accessible conditions. Small-town businesses relied on locks and familiarity, rather than advanced systems, to protect their assets. In this environment, criminal opportunity looked different. Instead of trying to overpower a system, the cleverest criminals sought to exploit its gaps, small, almost invisible weaknesses. And when done slowly enough, those weaknesses could be widened into a chasm. The target, a warehouse by the water. The story begins in Gothenburg, Sweden's second-largest city. Known for its shipyards, its bustling port, and its working-class identity, Gothenburg in the 1980s was a place where shipping containers piled high along the waterfront. Goods came and went. Cars from Germany, electronics from Japan, textiles from Asia. Among the many warehouses along the docks was one that stored imports waiting for distribution throughout Scandinavia. It was not glamorous, and it was certainly not glamorous in the way one thinks of a heist target. It held no gold bars, no priceless art, but it did hold something valuable in a very practical sense. Electronics, radios, cassette players, televisions, the kinds of consumer goods that were becoming highly desirable across Europe in the 1980s. For the workers who moved pallets and boxes through this warehouse, the goods were ordinary, part of the daily grind. But for a small group of thieves, they represented steady money, if only they could find a way to make them disappear without drawing attention. The method, a crime of patience. Most crimes unfold in a single burst of activity. The robbery happens, the safe is cracked, the goods are stolen, and the perpetrators flee. But in Gothenburg, this heist was different. Instead of taking everything at once, the thieves took almost nothing, at least at first. A few radios would vanish, a box of cassette tapes here, a carton of small electronics there, not enough to trigger alarm. In the paperwork of a busy warehouse, such disappearances could easily be chalked up to clerical error, miscounting, or shipping damage. And that was precisely the point. The thieves operated with such restraint that months could pass without anyone suspecting that a crime was underway. The missing items, so small in number compared to the total inventory, seemed insignificant. Yet quietly, a trickle became a stream. Over the course of months and eventually years, the group siphoned off thousands of goods. Their patience was almost monastic. They knew that greed would expose them, that taking too much too quickly would cause suspicion. So they moved slowly, invisibly, like water wearing down stone. The psychology of slowness. What makes a person commit a crime this way? To act not with boldness but with restraint. Criminologists later suggested that the thieves might have been workers themselves, people who understood the rhythms of the warehouse, the trust of their supervisors, and the blind spots of the system. To steal from the inside required not only knowledge, but also self-control. It required an ability to live with the temptation of easy gain, while choosing instead to wait and wait for years. This form of theft, sometimes referred to as inventory leakage, is among the hardest crimes to detect. A bank robbery makes headlines. A warehouse burglary triggers police reports. But the disappearance of a dozen radios in a sea of thousands, that might never be noticed. And when it is, the cause is rarely assumed to be deliberate theft. But in Gothenburg, by the mid-1980s, the numbers no longer added up. Discovery by numbers. It began with accountants, not detectives. A mid-level manager reviewing inventory noticed inconsistencies. The stock records didn't quite align with shipments received and sent. At first, it was small, a few percentage points off, but over time, the gap grew. The warehouse wasn't losing hundreds of units in a single shipment. It was losing them slowly, steadily, like a dripping faucet. The manager flagged the issue, and auditors were brought in. That's when the scale of the problem became clear. Over several years, thousands of items worth millions of krona had gone missing. And yet, there had been no alarms, no break-ins, no suspicious activity reported by security staff. It was as though the goods had evaporated into thin air. The realization brought both frustration and fascination. If the thefts had been sudden, they might have been easier to investigate. But because they were slow, they were hidden in the noise of daily operations. The investigation begins. By 1985, suspicions turned toward the workers themselves. Who else could have had such consistent access, such knowledge of the systems? The police were called in, but their work was hampered by the very slowness of the crime. There were no single nights of theft to examine, no broken locks to dust for fingerprints, no dramatic events to reconstruct. Instead, detectives had to think like the thieves, to imagine not what had been taken in one night, but what had been taken over years, to map patterns, interview staff, and look for the quiet irregularities that pointed to long-term dishonesty. It was painstaking, slow police work fitting, perhaps, for a crime that itself had been painstakingly slow. A crime without drama. When journalists eventually wrote about the case, they noted its unusual character. Here was a heist without spectacle, a theft that unfolded almost invisibly, right under the noses of those responsible for the goods. It was, in many ways, the perfect Scandinavian crime, restrained, patient, and quiet. No shots were fired, no lives were lost, but the financial impact was real and the betrayal of trust ran deep. The people of Gothenburg, when they finally heard about it, were surprised not by the fact of the theft, but by its nature. A heist that took years, a theft so slow it seemed almost like a trick of time. Closing thought. And so, as the mid-1980s wore on, investigators faced a puzzle. Who had done this, and how had they resisted the temptation to act faster? Who could live with the knowledge of a crime unfolding in such small steps and remain patient enough to see it through? It was a question that would drive the next stage of the investigation, and one that would reveal surprising truths about both the thieves and the system they exploited. The first time investigators walked through the Gothenburg warehouse, they were struck not by what they saw, but by what they didn't. There were no broken locks, no forced entries, no shattered windows. The thefts had left no scars. Instead, the space hummed with routine. Forklifts buzzed across concrete floors, workers in overalls hauled pallets, and the faint smell of sawdust and oil lingered in the air. To an outsider, it looked like a picture of order. But to the detectives, every box, every clipboard, every face was a potential clue in a crime that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Following the numbers, the auditors had already done the first part of the police's work for them. Their ledgers showed discrepancies stretching back nearly 5 years. Some shipments had left the warehouse light short by a dozen units, sometimes more. Other shipments had been received with slightly altered records. No single error was alarming, but together they painted a troubling picture. The auditors estimated the missing goods at several thousand cassette players, hundreds of televisions, and countless smaller electronics like portable radios and stereo components. By conservative measures, the losses were valued in the millions of Swedish krona. To the accountants, this was a financial crisis. To the police, it was an investigative nightmare. There was no single crime scene to cordon off. Instead, the theft was everywhere, spread across years and paperwork. Turning to the workers, detectives began by interviewing the warehouse staff. It was tedious work. Dozens of men worked shifts across the sprawling building, loading and unloading goods. Many had been with the company for decades. Some were nearing retirement, others were younger, new hires brought in during the boom years of shipping growth. The police knew the thefts required insider knowledge. No outsider could have walked in and taken so much without notice. That narrowed the field, but not enough. The interviews revealed something interesting: resentment. A number of workers complained that management was distant, that wages had stagnated even as profits rose. Some spoke bitterly about the company's success being built on their backs. Others admitted, with careful phrasing, that theft wasn't unheard of in warehouse life. "A box goes missing now and then," one worker shrugged. "It's not the end of the world." To the detectives, these comments hinted at a culture where small thefts might be tolerated. But they also blurred the line between petty pilfering and organized crime. Were these workers merely shrugging off the occasional stolen carton, or were they deflecting suspicion from something larger? Watching and waiting. Unable to catch the thieves in the act, the police turned to surveillance. Plainclothes officers rotated shifts in the warehouse, posing as temporary hires or maintenance staff. They observed how goods were logged, how shipments moved, and how the workers interacted. For weeks, nothing stood out. Workers smoked cigarettes during breaks, joked in the cafeteria, and complained about supervisors. Boxes moved, paperwork was signed, trucks departed. But slowly, patterns began to emerge. A few workers seemed to hover around certain pallets longer than others. A crate would be marked for shipping, then quietly diverted. A forklift would pause at an unusual angle, obscuring a load from sightlines. It was subtle but consistent. The thefts were not random at all, they were systematic. The quiet network. As the investigation deepened, detectives realized they weren't dealing with a single thief. This was a network. A handful of workers, perhaps no more than 5 or 6, were cooperating to skim goods from the warehouse. Their method was ingenious in its simplicity. A worker would misplace an item during loading. Instead of being recorded as part of a shipment, the item would be quietly removed, stashed in a corner or inside a truck bound for a local delivery. Later, during breaks or after hours, the stolen goods would be retrieved and smuggled out. The brilliance was in the scale. They never took too much, never enough to raise immediate suspicion. But over time, their patience allowed them to build what amounted to a parallel business. Following the goods. Knowing goods had vanished was one thing. Finding out where they went was another. Police began looking into black markets across Gothenburg. They checked pawn shops, flea markets, and second-hand electronics dealers. The breakthrough came from a small shop in a working-class neighborhood. The owner admitted he had been buying electronics from a man who always seemed to have surplus radios and cassette players. The goods were offered cheaply, cash only, no receipts. The description matched one of the warehouse workers. It was the first real link between the missing goods and the suspects. From there, detectives traced a chain of distribution. The stolen electronics had trickled out into the city, into neighboring towns, even across the border into Norway. What had begun as petty pilfering had become an underground pipeline, feeding Scandinavia's appetite for affordable consumer goods. Cracks in the patience. For years, the thieves' restraint had been their greatest strength, but now cracks began to show. Flush with success, some members of the group grew bolder. A worker who once smuggled radios began slipping entire boxes of televisions out of shipments. Another bought a new car, far beyond what his modest wages could explain. Neighbors whispered, supervisors noticed. The patience that had defined the crime was giving way to greed. Detectives, watching from the shadows, waited for the group to make a mistake big enough to expose them. The internal betrayal. That mistake came not from theft, but from betrayal. One of the workers, fearing he would be caught, quietly approached the police. He was not a mastermind, but a minor participant, lured into the scheme by promises of easy cash. Now, terrified of prison, he offered information in exchange for leniency. His testimony confirmed what investigators suspected. The thefts were coordinated, led by a small group of trusted employees. He described how items were marked, how shipments were altered, and how goods left the warehouse unnoticed. With his cooperation, police planned a sting. The sting operation. On a cold morning in late 1986, officers concealed themselves near the warehouse loading bay. They had been tipped off that a shipment would be skimmed that day, a box of stereo components bound for Stockholm. The operation unfolded almost too quietly to notice. A forklift diverted a pallet, a worker scribbled on a form, and the crate was pushed into a shadowed corner. Hours later, as the shift ended, one of the thieves moved to retrieve it. That was when the police stepped out. The arrests were swift, the workers stunned. After years of patience, the crime unraveled in a single moment of exposure. A crime laid bare. In the aftermath, the scale of the thefts became undeniable. Investigators presented evidence showing millions of krona in goods stolen over nearly half a decade. The network had been careful, but not perfect. Records, testimony, and seized goods painted a picture of a long-running scheme that had thrived on invisibility. For the public, the story was both baffling and oddly compelling. This was no dramatic bank heist, no violent gang war. It was a crime of shadows, a theft so slow that it seemed almost gentle until the numbers revealed its enormity. Closing thought. And yet, even with arrests made and confessions secured, one question lingered. How had the crime gone undetected for so long? Was it simply the thieves' patience? Or had the system itself been too trusting, too unprepared for deceit that moved at such a glacial pace? It was a question the courts would soon grapple with, as the case moved from warehouse floors to legal chambers where the true reckoning would unfold. When the suspects from the Gothenburg warehouse finally faced trial, the courtroom was not filled with the drama of hardened criminals or notorious gangsters. Instead, it was populated by men who looked, to the public eye, like ordinary workers. They wore modest suits, their hands still rough from years of manual labor. Some had families seated nervously in the gallery. And that was perhaps the most unsettling detail of the entire case. The men accused of stealing millions of krona in electronics did not look like thieves. They looked like neighbors, uncles, and fathers. The prosecution's case. The prosecutors, however, were determined to show that appearances could be deceiving. Piece by piece, they laid out the evidence. The missing goods, carefully documented by auditors spanning half a decade. The testimony of the betrayer, the worker who had come forward to describe the network from the inside. The surveillance reports, showing suspicious diversions of crates. The seized electronics, traced back to black market shops and tied directly to the accused. The picture that emerged was one of quiet but deliberate theft. Not impulsive, not desperate, but organized, planned with restraint and carried out with discipline. The prosecutors argued that this restraint made the crime even more dangerous. It was a theft that exploited trust, a betrayal committed in the slowest possible motion. The defense's argument. Defense attorneys, in contrast, painted their clients as victims of circumstance. They emphasized the culture of lax oversight in the warehouse, the years of stagnant wages, the atmosphere of discontent among workers. Yes, items had gone missing, they admitted. But was it fair to place the blame on a few men when the entire system seemed riddled with neglect? Some lawyers argued their clients had taken part only minimally, pressured by others in the group. One even suggested that the company bore equal responsibility for creating conditions where such theft could flourish unnoticed for so long. It was a difficult argument to make stick, but it resonated with some members of the public. After all, these were not masked bandits. They were men from the community, caught up in a strange, patient scheme. The courtroom atmosphere. Day after day, the trial unfolded with the slow pace that seemed fitting for a crime already defined by slowness. Witnesses were called, ledgers displayed, crates of electronics stacked as physical evidence. Journalists covering the proceedings noted the surreal quality of it all. Unlike other crime stories that commanded front-page headlines with tales of violence or scandal, this was a quieter spectacle, a case about numbers, patience, and trust. One reporter wrote that listening to the trial was like watching water carve a canyon so gradual as to seem invisible, until one day the depth becomes undeniable. The verdicts. In the end, the jury was persuaded by the weight of evidence. Several of the workers were convicted of long-running theft and conspiracy. The sentences varied. The ringleaders received prison terms of several years, while minor participants, including the one who had cooperated, were given lighter sentences or suspended terms. The company, too, faced harsh criticism. Though not criminally liable, its managers were chastised for their lack of oversight. The case revealed a troubling complacency in how valuable goods were tracked and safeguarded. For the thieves, the reckoning was clear. Their years of patience, their careful restraint, had ended in exposure and punishment. The public reaction. When the story reached the newspapers across Sweden, reactions were mixed. Some readers expressed outrage at the betrayal of trust. Others, however, admitted a strange fascination, even admiration for the thieves' patience. This wasn't a crime of violence, one editorial mused. It was a crime of waiting, a crime that required discipline most of us do not have. For many, that was what made the case unsettling. It suggested that ordinary people, given enough time and temptation, could quietly become extraordinary criminals. Lessons for investigators. Within police circles, the case became a study in how crimes can hide in slowness. Traditional policing is often reactive, responding to alarms, break-ins, or violence. But this case forced detectives to think differently. It highlighted the importance of audits, of careful monitoring, and of recognizing that theft doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it trickles, drop by drop, until the loss becomes a flood. In training seminars years later, the Gothenburg case was cited as an example of the patience principle. The idea that certain criminals exploit time as their greatest tool, betting that slowness will conceal their actions. Reflections on human nature. Looking back, the slow heist raised deeper questions. What makes a person commit a crime not out of desperation, but out of persistence? Was it greed, or simply opportunity stretched across years? Psychologists suggested that the thieves might have found a strange satisfaction in the ritual itself, the act of skimming, of hiding, of outwitting the system day after day. The slowness wasn't just a tactic, it may have been part of the allure. For others, the lesson was more sobering. Trust is fragile, even in societies built on cooperation and order. The warehouse had functioned for decades on an assumption of honesty. All it took was a handful of patient men to show how vulnerable that trust could be. The long shadow. Decades later, the Gothenburg heist remains a peculiar footnote in Scandinavian crime history. It lacks the glamour of a jewel theft or the menace of organized gangs, but in its very ordinariness lies its fascination. It was not a crime of speed, but of slowness, not of violence, but of quiet betrayal, a reminder that crime can take many forms, some almost invisible until it is too late. And perhaps that is why it lingers in memory, because it challenges our assumptions about what crime looks like and what patience, in the wrong hands, can achieve. Closing reflection. As you think about this case, one question lingers. If patience can be a virtue in ordinary life, what happens when it becomes the tool of a crime? Does time conceal wrongdoing, or does it simply sharpen it until the reckoning finally arrives? Story 2. The Oslo Library Forgery Scandal. When most people think of crime, they picture something tangible. A safe cracked open, a window shattered, a body missing. But sometimes the most unsettling crimes are the ones that hide in plain sight, written down in ink, bound between covers and tucked neatly onto the shelves of a library. That was the reality for the Oslo Public Library in the late 1980s, when staff discovered that their collection and archive of Norway's intellectual and cultural history had quietly been compromised. Not by theft, not by arson, but by forgery. It was a crime so understated that for years it went unnoticed. But when it was finally uncovered, it sent shockwaves through Norway's academic and cultural circles. Because it was not only about stolen knowledge, it was about the possibility that truth itself had been rewritten. Oslo in the 1980s. To understand the scandal, you have to imagine Oslo during this period. Norway was a country flush with oil wealth, but still deeply attached to its traditions of learning and culture. Libraries were not just places for students, they were repositories of national memory. The Oslo Public Library, one of the largest in the country, housed not only books but rare manuscripts, letters, and personal archives of writers, politicians, and scholars. Its reading rooms were filled with students scribbling notes, historians poring over documents, and elderly citizens reading newspapers. It was, by all appearances, a temple of trust, a place where words were sacred. The arrival of forgeries. The crime began quietly, almost invisibly. New acquisitions arrived at the library as they always had boxes of books, collections donated by estates, or purchases from antiquarian dealers. Librarians cataloged them, stamped them, and shelved them. Somewhere in that process, forged documents slipped through. They were not crude counterfeits. They were meticulous imitations, letters attributed to 19th century Norwegian writers, manuscripts supposedly penned by lesser-known intellectuals, even marginalia in books that appeared to be authentic. For years, no one questioned them. They sat on shelves, cited by researchers, and quietly folded themselves into Norway's cultural record. The discovery. The scandal only came to light when a doctoral student at the University of Oslo noticed something strange. While studying the correspondence of a minor poet from the 1800s, she compared a letter in the Oslo Public Library's collection with one held in a private archive. The handwriting was nearly identical, but not quite. Certain strokes seemed off. Certain flourishes looked too modern. Intrigued, she dug deeper. Comparing dates, paper stock, and ink composition, she realized that the library's letter might not be authentic at all. She brought her suspicions to her supervisor, who in turn contacted the library. At first, the staff resisted the idea. Forgeries, in their collection, impossible. But the student persisted, and eventually outside experts were called in. The expert eye. The experts began with handwriting analysis. They noted inconsistencies in penmanship across supposed letters of the same author. Then they examined the paper, discovering fibers that were anachronistic, too modern to belong to the period claimed. Finally, they studied the ink itself, using chemical analysis to show that it contained compounds not available in 19th century Norway. The verdict was damning. The documents were forgeries, and not just one or two. As librarians began combing through their holdings, they found dozens, possibly hundreds of suspicious items. Letters, marginalia, manuscripts. Some were poor imitations, others chillingly convincing. The realization sank in. Someone had infiltrated the library's collection, planting false history in the very heart of Norwegian culture. Who was behind it? The immediate question was obvious: who had done this? Attention turned to antiquarian dealers, the shadowy figures who dealt in rare books and manuscripts. In the 1970s and 80s, the trade was lightly regulated. A clever forger could produce documents, sell them to a dealer, and see them eventually pass to libraries or collectors without raising suspicion. The police began investigating, but the trail was murky. Some dealers claimed ignorance. Others had vanished from the trade years earlier. There were whispers of one particular figure, a talented but disgraced academic, said to have both the knowledge and the motive to carry out such forgeries, but concrete evidence was elusive. The impact on scholarship. The scandal was not just about the documents themselves. It was about the ripple effect they created. Researchers who had cited the forged letters in their dissertations were suddenly thrown into doubt. Biographies of writers that relied on these documents were now suspect. Decades of scholarship had to be re-examined, sources questioned, and narratives rewritten. For academics, it was a nightmare. Trust, the foundation of research, had been violated. The public reaction. When the story broke in Norwegian newspapers, the public was both fascinated and horrified. Here was a crime without violence, but with a violence of a different kind, a violence against truth itself. Some saw the forger as a kind of artist, a trickster exposing the fragility of history. Others condemned him as a vandal of culture. Editorials debated whether forgery could ever be considered a form of creativity, or whether it was simply deceit dressed up in ink. For the library staff, the scandal was deeply personal. Many felt shame that their beloved institution had been fooled. Some feared that public trust in libraries would be permanently damaged. Closing thought. And yet, even as the forgeries were uncovered, one question remained unresolved. How many were still hidden? If dozens had been found, might there be hundreds more, lurking quietly on the shelves, shaping the way Norway remembered its past? It was a question that would haunt the next phase of the investigation, an inquiry that would reveal not only the scope of the forgery, but the peculiar psychology of the person behind it. When librarians in Oslo realized that their shelves held not just history but carefully planted lies, the air inside the institution shifted. Staff who had once walked confidently through the archives now moved with suspicion, pulling volumes from shelves, peering at documents under brighter lights, and asking themselves, is this real or is this a forgery? The discovery was unsettling. In a library, truth is supposed to rest quietly between pages. To discover that some of those pages were false was like finding cracks in the foundation of a house you believed unshakable. Building the task force. The Oslo Public Library could not face the scandal alone. A task force was assembled, bringing together librarians, handwriting analysts, chemists, historians, and detectives from the Norwegian police. Each group had its own role. Librarians cataloged and flagged suspicious works. Handwriting experts compared documents with known samples. Chemists tested ink and paper for anachronistic elements. Historians scrutinized content, looking for phrases or ideas that did not match the era. Police officers traced the provenance of acquisitions, searching for a human culprit. It was an unusual coalition, academics and police officers sharing coffee over stacks of books, but it was necessary. The crime was unlike any Norway had faced before. The suspect pool. Suspicion quickly turned toward antiquarian dealers. In the 1970s and 80s, Norway had a thriving second-hand book market. Estate sales brought trunks of letters and manuscripts onto the market, while dealers supplied collectors and institutions. One name surfaced repeatedly, a dealer known for his wide network and unusual finds. He had provided several of the documents now flagged as forgeries, but when confronted, he insisted he had no idea they were false. "I sell what I buy," he told investigators. "If someone fools me, then I have been fooled as well." Still, detectives pressed him. Where had he obtained these items? Who sold them to him? His answers were vague, his records incomplete. Some believed he was hiding something. Others thought he was merely careless. Beyond dealers, suspicion also fell on academics. Forgery required not only craft but deep knowledge. To mimic a 19th century poet's handwriting, one had to know that poet's style intimately. To create plausible letters, one had to understand the context of the time. One former scholar in particular drew attention. He had been dismissed from a university post years earlier, rumored to have clashed with colleagues. Brilliant but bitter, he lived on the margins of Oslo's literary circles, and he had the skills paleography, access to rare texts, and a fascination with Norway's cultural history. But suspicion is not proof. Investigators needed more. The anatomy of a forgery. To catch a forger, one must understand the craft. The task force began dissecting the forged documents. Under microscopes, the handwriting showed inconsistencies, strokes that betrayed a modern hand unused to quills, loops too smooth for period style. The ink, when dissolved and tested, contained synthetic dyes only developed in the 20th century. The paper was even more telling. Some sheets carried faint watermarks from manufacturers who did not exist until decades after the supposed date of writing. Others had been artificially aged, tea-stained, crumpled, or even baked in ovens to simulate the brittleness of time. It was meticulous work, but not flawless. For every letter that fooled a librarian, the scientists could uncover its deception with patient analysis. Yet the more they uncovered, the more they realized the scope of the crime. Dozens of items were now confirmed as false. Some had been in the collection for years, cited in academic work, footnoted in dissertations. The scandal was widening. Academic fallout. The University of Oslo, already tied to the scandal through its students and scholars, faced uncomfortable questions. How many theses had relied on forged documents? How many published works would now have to be corrected or even retracted? Professors debated fiercely. Some insisted that the damage was minimal, that the forged documents were peripheral. Others feared that entire narratives of Norwegian literary history had been compromised. One historian remarked bitterly, "It is not only that the forger deceived us, it is that he made us deceive ourselves. We believed what we wanted to believe." The psychology of forgery. Why would anyone go to such lengths? For money, for ego, for revenge? Criminologists studying the case offered several possibilities. Forgery, they argued, was often about more than profit. It was about creating an alternate reality, slipping one's own work into the bloodstream of history. Perhaps the forger wanted to test the experts, to prove that he was smarter than the institutions that had rejected him. Perhaps he wanted to rewrite cultural memory, to insert his fingerprints into the national story. And there was money to be made. While no single forged letter would fetch a fortune, a steady trickle of sales to dealers and libraries could provide modest income. Combined with the satisfaction of deception, it was motive enough. A breakthrough lead. The investigation stalled until a crucial lead emerged. A librarian recalled a small detail. Several of the forgeries had arrived not through large acquisitions, but as part of donations. Boxes dropped off anonymously, or under vague provenance. One donation in particular stood out. A collection of supposed manuscripts attributed to a little-known 19th century essayist had been left with only a first name scribbled on a slip of paper. Cross-checking delivery records, police identified the car used a vehicle traced back to none other than the disgraced academic long suspected of involvement. It was not a smoking gun, but it was a trail. Surveillance and search. Police placed the suspect under discreet surveillance. He lived quietly in a modest Oslo apartment, rarely entertaining visitors. But one evening, they watched as he carried a bundle of papers to a nearby antiquarian shop. When he emerged empty-handed, detectives entered the shop. There on the counter lay a set of documents attributed to a Norwegian dramatist. To trained eyes, they bore the telltale signs of forgery. With this evidence, a search warrant was obtained. Inside the suspect's apartment, investigators found a workshop of deceit. Sheets of paper stacked by type, bottles of ink mixed with chemicals, magnifying glasses, books on 19th century handwriting, and most damning drafts of forged letters unfinished, their lines crossed out and rewritten. The forger was unmasked. Closing thought. Yet, even as the police carried away boxes of evidence, another question haunted the librarians and scholars. If these were the forgeries he left unfinished, how many of his completed works still sat on their shelves, undetected? The scandal was no longer about one man alone. It was about the fragility of truth itself. When the suspect, the once promising academic turned shadowy forger, was brought to trial in Oslo, the courtroom carried a different weight than in ordinary criminal cases. There were no grieving families, no stolen fortunes dramatically displayed, no police officers describing shootouts or chases. Instead, there were boxes of letters, manuscripts, and scraps of paper, each one a quiet piece of evidence in a crime against memory itself. The prosecution's argument. Prosecutors laid out their case with methodical precision. They presented the tools seized from the suspect's apartment: aging chemicals, paper stock, ink mixtures, and practice sheets filled with failed attempts at mimicking 19th century handwriting. They displayed the forged documents themselves, side by side with authentic ones. Experts pointed to the subtle but undeniable flaws: strokes too modern, watermarks too new, ink too synthetic. Perhaps most damning was the provenance trail. Several donations and sales traced back directly to the accused. The anonymous drop-offs at the library had been matched to his car. Dealers testified that he had provided them with letters, always insisting they were rare finds from private collections. The prosecutor's message was clear. This was no accident, no academic exercise gone astray. It was a deliberate campaign of deception, stretching years, aimed at fooling Norway's most trusted institutions. The defense's counter. The defense team tried to shift the narrative. They painted their client as a misunderstood intellectual, a man obsessed with history, who blurred the line between scholarship and art. Was forgery truly theft, they asked, if no money had changed hands directly? Could a forged letter, admired and studied for years, be considered a work of art in its own right? Some even argued that his work highlighted the fragility of historical truth, that by exposing how easily experts could be fooled, he had provided a valuable service. But for many in the courtroom, these arguments rang hollow. The forgeries were not labeled as art. They were presented as authentic, used in research, and woven into Norway's cultural record. Whatever the intellectual justification, the act was still deceit. The courtroom atmosphere. The trial attracted unusual spectators. Scholars sat alongside journalists, both groups scribbling notes as if taking part in a seminar rather than a legal proceeding. Students came to witness the downfall of a man who had once walked the same university halls. There was a strange hush in the air, as though everyone present knew that this was about more than one man's crime. It was about trust in the written word. The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the court delivered its judgment. The accused was found guilty of fraud, forgery, and the deliberate sale of false documents. His sentence, while not as long as that of violent criminals, was significant for a non-violent crime. He received several years in prison, along with a ban from working in academic or cultural institutions. The verdict sent a clear message. In Norway, history itself was to be protected with the same seriousness as property or life. The academic reckoning. For scholars, however, the trial was only the beginning of their ordeal. The damage to research was extensive. Doctoral dissertations that had cited forged letters were scrutinized. Some students were forced to withdraw their work entirely. Professors issued corrections or retractions. Biographies of Norwegian writers were amended, with publishers releasing statements to clarify the contamination of sources. The University of Oslo launched new guidelines on source verification. Historians were urged to approach archives with skepticism, to corroborate letters with external evidence, and to treat too perfect finds with suspicion. The scandal shook the academic community to its core. Trust once assumed was now conditional. Cultural debate. Beyond academia, the public engaged in heated debate. Was the forger a criminal or a failed artist? Some editorialists argued that his meticulous craft deserved recognition, if only as an example of the artistry of deception. Others dismissed this as romanticizing dishonesty. Forgery, one columnist wrote, is theft with ink instead of a knife. It steals not from wallets but from truth. The debate echoed through Norwegian culture. Could history ever be fully secure, or was it always vulnerable to the manipulations of clever hands and clever lies? The legacy for libraries. In the years that followed, libraries across Scandinavia tightened their procedures. Donations were scrutinized more carefully. Provenance became a watchword. Chemical testing of inks and papers became routine for rare acquisitions. The Oslo Public Library, once humbled, became a leader in document authentication. What had begun as a scandal turned into a turning point for archival practice. And yet whispers persisted. Even decades later, some scholars wondered, had every forgery been caught? Or were there still false documents lurking quietly on the shelves, waiting to be cited once more? Reflections on truth. The scandal revealed an unsettling truth, that history is not fixed but fragile. We rely on paper, ink, and the honesty of those who preserve them. But paper can be forged, ink can be faked, and honesty can falter. For the students who first uncovered the deception, it was a sobering lesson. For the public, it was a reminder that even in the calm corridors of a library, crime can thrive. The forger's greatest tool had not been his pen, but the trust of those who believed in the sanctity of words. And that, perhaps, was the deepest crime of all. Closing reflection. As you think about this case, one question lingers. If our histories can be rewritten so easily, how much of what we believe is truly secure, and how much rests on trust that may, one day, be broken? Story 3. The Postman Who Stole Time, Denmark, 1980s. In the Denmark of the early 1980s, few institutions were as trusted as the postal service. The postman was more than just a deliverer of mail. He was a familiar figure, walking his daily route in sun and snow, a symbol of reliability in a society that prized order and trust. But trust can be fragile, and sometimes it hides secrets. In a small Danish town not far from Aarhus, the local community began to sense something was wrong. Letters failed to arrive. Parcels vanished. Payments sent through the post never reached their destinations. At first, the complaints seemed isolated, the kinds of errors that could be chalked up to misdelivery or bureaucratic inefficiency. But as the weeks stretched into months, a pattern began to emerge. Something or someone was tampering with the flow of time marked by postmarks and stamps. And at the center of it all was a single man, a postman who, quietly and patiently, was stealing not just mail, but time itself. Denmark in the 1980s. To understand the scandal, it's important to picture Denmark at the time. It was a country balancing tradition with modernization. Telephones were becoming more common, but the mail remained essential. Bills, legal notices, pensions, and even personal savings often moved through envelopes. For rural communities especially, the daily delivery was a lifeline. The Danish Postal Service, one of the oldest in Europe, operated with military precision. Routes were carefully assigned. Postmen wore uniforms, carried satchels, and were known by name in their neighborhoods. They were, in many ways, guardians of time, ensuring that the rhythm of communication never faltered, which is why the disruption of that rhythm caused such unease. The complaints begin. It started with whispers. A farmer said he never received a government subsidy form. A shopkeeper complained that invoices failed to arrive, throwing his accounts into chaos. Pensioners, waiting for checks, reported unexplained delays. The post office investigated, but records showed the letters had been processed. To the clerks, it looked like a problem with the senders. To the senders, it looked like a problem with the post. And yet, when patterns were mapped, one thing stood out. Nearly all the missing letters had passed through the same small branch office and along the same route. The man on the route. The postman assigned to that route was a man in his early 50s. Neighbors described him as quiet, dependable, a man who had carried mail for decades. He was the kind of person people waved to without thinking, the kind of person who seemed woven into the fabric of everyday life. But beneath that calm exterior, investigators would later discover he had begun to see opportunity in the bags of mail he carried. At first, it might have been temptation, a letter thick with cash or a parcel that looked valuable. But soon, the thefts became systematic. Letters were opened and resealed. Money orders disappeared. Entire sacks of mail were sometimes hidden, delaying delivery by days or even weeks. For those waiting on the other end, it felt as though time itself had stalled. A birthday card arrived after the birthday. A tax notice came too late. An opportunity was missed because a letter never came at all. A crime of time. What made this crime so unusual was its nature. Unlike a bank robbery or burglary, the damage was not immediate or dramatic. It was dispersed, scattered across hundreds of lives in small, frustrating ways. Time was stolen not in hours, but in moments, a delayed payment here, a missed appointment there. For the victims, it was infuriating, but also strangely intangible. How do you measure the theft of something that never arrived? This was the postman's advantage. His thefts blended into the background noise of everyday inconvenience, and for a long time, no one thought to blame him. Suspicion grows. Eventually, however, the volume of complaints became too large to ignore. The Postal Service launched an internal review. Clerks double-checked routes. Supervisors shadowed deliveries. And slowly, suspicion narrowed onto the quiet postman. Colleagues noted that he often lingered after shifts, taking longer than necessary to sort his bags. Others recalled that he occasionally delivered certain items late, shrugging it off as lost in the shuffle. One day, inspectors decided to test him. They prepared a batch of test letters, some containing cash, others with tracking slips invisible to the casual eye, and placed them in his route. When those letters failed to arrive, the evidence was clear. The search. Police were brought in quietly, not wanting to alarm the community. They followed the postman's route, observing his behavior. He walked as he always did, nodding to neighbors, slipping letters into boxes. But in the middle of his shift, he detoured, carrying a bundle into his car. When officers later searched his home, they were stunned. In his attic, stacked. Story 3. The Postman Who Stole Time. Most crimes involve money, property, or reputation. But in one quiet corner of Denmark in the 1980s, the thing stolen was something more intangible: time itself. The people of a small town outside Aarhus didn't realize they were victims at first. Their bills still arrived, though sometimes late. Their letters from friends were occasionally delayed or didn't show up at all. Packages sometimes seemed to vanish, only to turn up weeks later, battered and oddly repacked. It was frustrating, yes, but no one thought it was criminal. After all, the Postal Service had always been a trusted institution in Denmark, a vital artery that connected villages and cities, families and businesses. But as the delays accumulated and suspicions grew, the town would discover that their trusted postman, the very man they saw every day on his bicycle, tipping his cap as he passed, had been quietly undermining the flow of time itself. Denmark in the 1980s. To understand this story, you need to imagine Denmark in the mid-1980s. The country was undergoing steady modernization, but much of daily life still relied on institutions that had changed little in a century. The Danish Postal Service was one such institution, reliable, efficient, and deeply woven into the fabric of community life. In smaller towns, the postman was more than just a civil servant. He was a neighbor, a confidant, and sometimes even the first to know about births, deaths, and marriages. Mail was not just correspondence. It was news, connection, and lifeline. Which is why the events in this town struck such a raw nerve. The idea that the postman himself could betray that trust felt almost unthinkable. The first complaints. The trouble began subtly. A farmer complained that an order for tractor parts never arrived. A young woman said her pen pal letters from Germany had stopped coming. A shopkeeper grumbled that invoices were delayed, causing awkward phone calls with suppliers. At first, these seemed like isolated inconveniences. The post office blamed clerical mix-ups, weather delays, or the occasional misrouting of international mail. But when the local newspaper began receiving letters weeks after their postmarks, eyebrows rose higher. By 1984, the town was buzzing with rumors. Was the Postal Service overwhelmed? Were thieves targeting packages? Or was something stranger happening? A curious pattern. One retired schoolteacher began keeping a notebook, recording when expected letters failed to arrive. She compared notes with her neighbors. Patterns emerged. Delays clustered along a single postal route. The common denominator, the same postman. He was a familiar figure, middle-aged, with a cheerful manner, often stopping to chat during his rounds. Nobody wanted to suspect him, but as the evidence mounted, whispers spread. Who was the postman? His name was Lars Jensen, and by all outward appearances, he was ordinary. He had worked for the Danish Postal Service for nearly 2 decades. He lived modestly in a rented flat, rode his bicycle to work, and had no known vices beyond a fondness for crossword puzzles and black coffee. But like many ordinary men, Lars carried private disappointments. He had once dreamed of becoming a teacher but never completed his training. His marriage had ended years earlier, leaving him alone. His salary as a postman was steady but unspectacular, and according to colleagues, he sometimes complained that people treated the mail with more importance than they treated the men who delivered it. Perhaps that bitterness planted the first seed of what would become his peculiar crime. The hoard. What investigators would eventually discover shocked them. Lars had not been discarding the letters or selling stolen packages for profit. Instead, he had been hoarding them. For reasons that were never entirely clear, he had begun setting aside mail instead of delivering it. A misplaced letter here, a delayed package there. At first, it might have been absent-mindedness, but soon it became deliberate. By the time authorities intervened, they found thousands of undelivered letters stacked in boxes in his apartment. Some had been opened, others not. Newspapers yellowed with age. Birthday cards for children now grown, official notices long expired all sat in quiet piles. as though time itself had been paused. The community's reaction. When the discovery was made public, the town reeled. People joked darkly that Lars had stolen time, robbing them not of valuables, but of moments they could never get back. A grandmother never saw her grandson's drawing. A young man missed out on a job interview invitation. Lovers quarreled over letters that never arrived, their words stranded in dusty boxes. For a community that had trusted its postman implicitly, the betrayal was deeply personal. Closing thought. But the central question remained unanswered. Why? Why would a man entrusted with the flow of communication choose to stop it, to trap it in his own home? Was it spite, illness, or something more complicated? That mystery would drive the investigation that followed, as police and psychologists tried to unravel the mind of the postman who stole time. When police finally entered Lars Jensen's modest apartment in Aarhus County, they expected to find clues to theft, perhaps cash from stolen money orders or goods stripped from missing parcels. What they found instead left them speechless. Boxes, dozens of them, some neatly stacked, others spilling over into corners and closets. Each was filled with letters, parcels, and newspapers. Thousands upon thousands of items meant for delivery frozen in place, preserved like artifacts in a strange private archive. To investigators, it was a crime scene unlike any they had encountered. There were no weapons, no victims in the traditional sense, and no financial windfall to explain the behavior. Instead, there were letters, birthday cards unopened, bills long expired, packages still wrapped in brown paper and string. The evidence did not speak of greed, it spoke of obsession. Cataloging the chaos. The first task was monumental. Every item in Lars's apartment had to be cataloged, traced, and wherever possible, delivered to its rightful recipient even if years late. Postal inspectors, aided by police, carefully opened boxes, noting postmarks, addresses, and dates. The backlog stretched years. Some letters bore stamps from the late 1970s, suggesting Lars had begun his hoarding long before suspicions arose. Others were recent, only weeks old, snatched from circulation just before discovery. The contents were heartbreaking. A mother's letter to her son serving in the military, filled with worry and love. A wedding invitation from 1981, never reaching its guest. Bank notices warning of overdue payments, long since irrelevant. Love letters, their ink faded, their emotions stranded in time. For recipients, receiving these letters years later was surreal. Some wept at words they thought had been lost forever. Others could only shake their heads, saying the letters no longer mattered the moment had passed. Lars's response. When confronted, Lars did not deny what he had done. He admitted calmly that he had withheld mail, but he struggled to explain why. I meant to deliver them, he told police. I just couldn't. Pressed further, he gave contradictory reasons. Sometimes he claimed he was overwhelmed by the workload. Other times, he suggested he disliked the pressure of being the community's messenger. Every letter felt like responsibility, he said. Too much responsibility. Psychologists brought in later described his behavior as a form of compulsive hoarding, not of objects for personal use, but of duties avoided. By refusing to deliver the mail, Lars may have felt he was pushing back against the expectations that weighed on him. The community's frustration. News of Lars's actions spread quickly through the town. People lined up at the post office, desperate to know if their letters had been among those withheld. A local shopkeeper recalled his frustration. I thought my suppliers in Copenhagen were cheating me, not sending invoices. All along, they were here in those boxes. A young woman discovered that her childhood pen pal letters from Germany had been sitting unopened for years. I wondered why she stopped writing, she said. Now I know she never got my replies either. The sense of betrayal was profound. Lars had not stolen money or jewels, but he had stolen moments, irretrievable slices of life. Investigators puzzle. From a legal standpoint, the case was complicated. Was Lars guilty of theft? Technically, he had not profited from the mail. Was it destruction of property? Not quite, the items were still intact. Ultimately, prosecutors charged him with breach of duty and obstruction of the postal system, crimes serious enough in a country where the mail was considered a vital public service. The challenge for the court would be less about proving his actions, since the evidence was overwhelming, and more about understanding his motives. Psychological analysis. Experts examined Lars's background. He had grown up in a modest household, the son of a factory worker. His teachers described him as intelligent but withdrawn, prone to daydreaming. He trained briefly as a teacher but failed to complete his studies, sliding into postal work instead. Colleagues described him as diligent but peculiar. He sometimes lingered too long over sorting, double-checking details to the point of inefficiency. Others recalled that he seemed indifferent to schedules, often arriving late at the depot. Psychologists suggested that Lars may have viewed mail not as a duty, but as a burden, a daily flood of tasks he felt unable to fulfill. By hoarding the letters, he exerted control. He decided when, or whether, communication flowed. It was, in its own strange way, an assertion of power. The symbolism of stolen time. Journalists covering the case seized on a poetic angle, that Lars had stolen time. Because letters are not just paper, they are anchors in moments. A love letter matters in its immediacy. A birthday card means little if it arrives years late. By withholding them, Lars had distorted the flow of life in his community. One columnist wrote, "He did not steal money, but he stole something more precious, the right of people to live their moments when they came." A divided town. Public opinion fractured. Some saw Lars as a criminal who had violated sacred trust. "The postman is supposed to connect us," one resident said bitterly. "He cut us off instead." Others were oddly sympathetic. "Maybe he was lonely," one neighbor suggested. "Maybe keeping the letters made him feel less alone." In cafes and living rooms, people debated his motives. Was he a petty saboteur, a man broken by pressure, or a peculiar figure who turned mail into a private museum of lost time? Closing thought. The investigation left more questions than answers. Lars admitted to hoarding the mail but never fully explained why. His motives remained a blend of frustration, compulsion, and mystery. And as the case prepared to move into the courtroom, the town braced itself for a strange reckoning. How do you punish a man who did not steal for profit, but stole something as abstract and as irreplaceable as time? The courtroom in Aarhus was unusually crowded the morning Lars Jensen went on trial. Townspeople who had once waved at him as he passed on his bicycle now packed the benches, eager to hear how justice would weigh a crime that was at once ordinary and surreal. There were no victims seated in black, no grieving families demanding punishment. Instead, there were citizens clutching yellowed envelopes, delayed bills, and long-lost letters, each one a reminder of how their lives had been quietly disrupted by the man standing in the dock. The charges. The prosecution laid out its case in sober terms. Lars was charged with breach of duty, obstruction of the postal system, and mishandling government property. These might sound bureaucratic compared to grand charges of robbery or fraud, but in Denmark's tightly regulated civil service, they carried weight. The mail was not just correspondence. It was considered part of the nation's infrastructure, as essential as trains or electricity. By hoarding mail, prosecutors argued, Lars had betrayed not only individuals but the state itself. The prosecution's case. Prosecutors presented the evidence. The hoard itself, thousands of letters and parcels retrieved from Lars's apartment, carefully cataloged. Testimonies from postal inspectors, who described how entire routes had been paralyzed by his actions. Impact statements from townspeople: the grandmother who never saw her grandson's birthday card, the young man who missed a job opportunity, the couple who fought bitterly over letters that never came. The prosecutors emphasized that Lars had not acted out of necessity. He had not sold valuables from the mail or stolen cash. Instead, he had chosen deliberately to withhold communication. This was not poverty-driven theft, one prosecutor said. It was sabotage of trust. The defense. Lars's defense attorney took a different tack. He portrayed his client not as a criminal but as a troubled man overwhelmed by his duties. He did not seek profit, the lawyer argued. He did not harm for the sake of harm. He became trapped in a cycle of delay, shame, and avoidance. Psychological evaluations supported this view, diagnosing Lars with compulsive hoarding disorder and depressive tendencies. Experts explained that once he began withholding letters, the act became harder to stop. The shame of his initial neglect fed into avoidance, which in turn created a spiraling compulsion. In this narrative, Lars was not malicious, but a man whose illness had spread its consequences across an entire community. Lars speaks. When asked to address the court, Lars's words were halting, almost apologetic. "I know I failed in my duty," he said softly. "Every day I told myself I would catch up, that I would deliver them tomorrow, but tomorrow never came." He looked down as he added, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I only wanted the letters to stop pressing on me." His words left some in the courtroom pitying him, while others remained furious. For them, it was not about his intent but about the birthdays missed, the trust broken, the time stolen. The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the court delivered its judgment. Lars Jensen was found guilty on all counts. The sentence was carefully measured. He was given 3 years in prison, reduced for good behavior and psychological treatment. He was also barred from holding any public service position for the rest of his life. For some, the punishment seemed harsh for a crime without financial gain. For others, it was too light, given the scale of disruption. The truth was that the crime did not fit neatly into the usual categories of justice. The community's reaction. In the town, reactions were mixed. Some felt relieved to see the matter resolved, though no sentence could return the lost time. Others expressed sympathy, seeing in Lars not a villain but a man undone by his own limitations. When the undelivered letters were finally distributed years late, they stirred complex emotions. A mother received a letter from her son who had since passed away, his words frozen in an earlier time. A couple laughed through tears as they opened love letters from their youth, only to realize the fight they once had was caused by silence, not rejection. In these moments, the community understood the peculiar cruelty of Lars's crime. Not theft of things, but theft of moments that could never be relived. Broader lessons. For the Danish Postal Service, the scandal was a wake-up call. Procedures changed. Regular audits, stricter oversight of delivery routes, and psychological support for postal workers who struggled with stress. Nationally, the story became a cautionary tale, often cited in training sessions as a reminder that trust must be protected not just from greed, but from human frailty. Reflections on time. Looking back, journalists and criminologists alike noted the uniqueness of the case. Lars had not been driven by profit or ideology. Instead, he had waged a quiet, private battle against responsibility itself, and in doing so, he had robbed his neighbors of something irreplaceable: their time. One commentator summed it up best. He stole without stealing, harmed without violence, and left a mark not on bank accounts, but on memory. His crime was to turn life's moments into unopened envelopes. Closing reflection. As you reflect on this case, one question lingers. Can justice ever account for lost time? Or are some thefts those of moments, connections, and words unsent beyond the reach of courts and sentences? Story 4. The Cheese Smugglers of Gothenburg. In the hierarchy of criminal enterprises, smuggling usually conjures images of liquor, weapons, or narcotics. But in Gothenburg during the late 1970s and early 1980s, the contraband was far less dramatic and yet strangely lucrative. Cheese. Yes, cheese. Ordinary wheels of Gouda, Edam, and cheddar purchased cheaply in one country, ferried across borders, and sold at a profit in another. It may sound absurd, but in Scandinavia, where import restrictions, tariffs, and food policies created price gaps across national lines, cheese became a surprisingly valuable commodity for smugglers willing to skirt the rules. And in Gothenburg, Sweden's great port city, a quiet network of opportunists turned dairy into black market gold. Sweden's cheese problem. To understand why cheese became contraband, you have to understand the policies of the time. In the 1970s, Sweden tightly regulated food imports to protect its domestic dairy industry. Tariffs on foreign cheeses were steep, and quotas limited how much could enter the country legally. As a result, imported cheeses, especially Dutch and British varieties, were expensive luxuries in Swedish shops. Meanwhile, across the North Sea in the Netherlands and the UK, the same products were sold cheaply and in abundance. That price gap created temptation. Smugglers realized that if they could bring foreign cheese into Sweden without paying tariffs, they could sell it privately at a hefty profit while still undercutting store prices. And so cheese smuggling was born. Gothenburg, a smuggler's gateway. Gothenburg, with its vast port and ferry connections to the UK, Germany, and Denmark, was the perfect staging ground. Cargo flowed constantly through its docks. Ferries arrived daily with cars, trucks, and passengers. In that chaos, a few extra wheels of cheese could be hidden, easily stuffed in car trunks, piled under blankets, or declared as personal food supplies. Authorities inspected shipments, of course, but resources were limited. Customs officers looked for alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs, not necessarily dairy products. Cheese lacked the drama of contraband, which was precisely why it made such an effective cover. The smugglers. The smuggling network wasn't run by hardened gangsters. Instead, it consisted largely of small-time operators, lorry drivers, fishermen, even ordinary families taking the ferry to England and back. They would load their cars with as much cheese as they could manage, then drive off the boat into Sweden, blending into the flow of tourists and traders. Some operated on a modest scale, selling a few wheels to neighbors or friends. Others became more organized, building quiet distribution networks in Gothenburg and beyond. One police report later described a group of dockworkers who used their shifts to smuggle entire pallets of cheese into Sweden, hidden among legitimate cargo. A profitable venture. The profits, though not astronomical, were steady. A wheel of Dutch Edam bought cheaply abroad might fetch twice its cost in Sweden. Multiply that by dozens of wheels per trip, and a smuggler could supplement his income handsomely. For some, it was simply a way to make ends meet. For others, it became a business in its own right. Rumors spread of certain cafes and restaurants in Gothenburg serving special, imported cheeses at prices locals couldn't resist. Suspicion grows. By the late 1970s, customs officials began noticing odd trends. Certain ferry routes seemed to bring back far more personal groceries than seemed reasonable. A family of 4 might declare 50 kilograms of cheese. Truck drivers insisted they had packed snacks that somehow weighed more than their cargo. At first, authorities chuckled. Who would risk smuggling cheese? But as the scale grew, the financial impact on Sweden's dairy industry became impossible to ignore. Legitimate importers complained. Domestic producers warned of unfair competition. The government decided to act. The investigations begin. Customs officers began tightening inspections on ferry arrivals. They weighed cars, opened coolers, and cut into suspicious wheels. What they found confirmed their suspicions. Smuggling was rampant. Some seizures were almost comical. In one case, officers discovered a van loaded entirely with Gouda wheels, hidden beneath a thin layer of fishing nets. In another, a couple returning from England had filled every inch of their station wagon with cheddar blocks, leaving barely enough room to sit. Each discovery painted a clearer picture. Cheese smuggling wasn't a joke. It was a thriving underground trade. Community reaction. When news of the seizures hit local papers, reactions ranged from amusement to outrage. Some citizens laughed at the absurdity. Others criticized the smugglers for undermining Swedish farmers. One editorial captured the tone. "We thought our borders were threatened by drugs and weapons. Who knew the real enemy was Edom?" Yet behind the humor, there was seriousness. The smuggling highlighted tensions between government policies, consumer desires, and the creative ways ordinary people responded to economic pressure. Closing thought. By the early 1980s, customs officers knew they had uncovered only the tip of the dairy iceberg. For every car caught with contraband cheese, how many more slipped through? And were the small-time smugglers acting alone, or was there a larger, organized network behind the trade? The next stage of the investigation would reveal just how far the cheese trade had spread, and how authorities tried, sometimes clumsily, sometimes cleverly, to fight a crime that few had ever taken seriously. By 1981, Swedish customs officers were no longer laughing. What had begun as a curiosity, passengers returning from the continent with suspiciously large quantities of cheese, was now recognized as a significant smuggling trade. The problem was not just the volume, but the organization. Investigators realized they were no longer dealing with families sneaking back a few wheels under blankets. This was a coordinated enterprise. Tricks of the trade. Smugglers grew inventive. They learned quickly that simply piling cheese into car trunks was a recipe for seizure, so they developed clever methods. False floors. Lorry drivers installed hidden compartments in their trucks, filling them with wheels of cheese beneath legitimate cargo. Fish cover-ups. Fishermen returning from the North Sea stashed cheese beneath crates of freshly caught herring, hoping the smell would deter inspectors from digging deeper. Frozen disguise. Some smugglers froze blocks of cheddar solid, then stacked them in with declared shipments of frozen meat. To the untrained eye, they looked like odd cuts of pork or beef. Personal excess. Families traveling by ferry claimed to be returning with personal groceries. One memorable case saw a man insist that the 50 wheels of Edam in his trunk were for a family reunion. Customs officers, increasingly skeptical, began cutting into suspicious wheels, only to find that some smugglers had hollowed out ordinary bread loaves, stuffing them with slices of contraband cheese. The creativity might have been amusing if the profits weren't so real. The profits behind dairy. Authorities estimated that successful smugglers could double or even triple their money per trip. A wheel of Dutch Edam, purchased cheaply in Rotterdam, could fetch far more in Gothenburg's under-the-table markets. Restaurants became quiet customers. A cafe owner could buy smuggled cheese for half the legal price, serve it to patrons, and boost profits without raising suspicion. By the early 1980s, entire underground distribution chains had formed. Dockworkers smuggled pallets into Sweden. Small-time operators sold wheels to local shops. And in some neighborhoods, you could knock on the right back door and buy imported cheese as easily as bootleg liquor. Customs fights back. The Swedish government responded with a mix of enforcement and public messaging. Customs agents increased ferry inspections, using dogs trained not for drugs, but for the scent of dairy. Posters appeared at ferry terminals. Declare your goods honestly. Don't let cheese cost you your freedom. Authorities also staged publicized seizures, displaying stacks of confiscated wheels in photographs for the press. The images, equal parts ridiculous and stern, were meant to signal that cheese smuggling was not harmless fun, but a crime with consequences. The first major raid. In 1982, police and customs launched their first coordinated raid on what they believed to be an organized smuggling operation. Acting on a tip, they raided a warehouse on the outskirts of Gothenburg. Inside, they found more than 2 tons of cheese stacked in crates, wrapped in foreign labels, ready for distribution. The haul included Gouda, cheddar, and Swiss varieties. The suspects, a mix of dock workers and small businessmen, were arrested. For the first time, cheese smuggling in Sweden was treated as organized crime rather than a petty nuisance. The public reacts. News of the raid hit the front pages. Photos of police standing beside mountains of seized cheese circulated widely, sparking both amusement and outrage. Some citizens found it absurd that so much attention was being given to dairy. Is this really the biggest problem Sweden faces? One letter to the editor asked. Others defended the crackdown, pointing out that the black market undercut Swedish farmers. Our dairy industry feeds this country, another editorial argued. Why should smugglers line their pockets while honest workers suffer? The debate revealed a cultural tension between the Scandinavian tradition of trust and regulation and the human tendency to bend rules when opportunity presents itself. International complications. The smuggling problem was not limited to Sweden. Across Scandinavia, similar schemes flourished. Danish authorities intercepted smugglers on ferries from Germany. Norwegian officials noted cheese being brought across the border in suspicious volumes. The issue highlighted the broader European problem of uneven food tariffs. Goods that were cheap and plentiful in one country became lucrative contraband in another. Cheese, wine, butter, and even chocolate became part of a quiet underground economy. Sweden's crackdown was therefore as much about asserting sovereignty as it was about dairy. Smugglers strike back. Criminals, however, adapted as fast as authorities. When inspections tightened at ferry terminals, smugglers shifted to fishing boats. When customs dogs grew better at detecting dairy, smugglers vacuum-sealed cheese to disguise its scent. One infamous case involved a smuggler disguising cheese wheels as spare tires. When officers tapped the tires, they sounded odd, prompting inspection and the discovery of a dozen wheels packed inside rubber shells. Each new trick fueled the cat-and-mouse game, with customs refining techniques and smugglers innovating further. The quiet victims. Beyond the comedy, there were real consequences. Domestic dairy farmers saw their sales decline. Legitimate importers struggled to compete with under-the-table prices. Tax revenues from tariffs dropped. Meanwhile, ordinary consumers were caught in the middle. Some appreciated the lower prices of black market cheese. Others worried about food safety, since smuggled goods bypassed health inspections. The scandal forced Swedes to confront uncomfortable truths about their relationship with regulation, affordability, and everyday crime. Closing thought. By 1983, customs officials knew they were facing not just small-time opportunists, but an underground economy woven into Gothenburg's port life. The next stage of the crackdown would pit organized smuggling groups against determined authorities, leading to surprising arrests and even stranger courtroom battles. The courtroom in Gothenburg was an unusual stage for a drama about cheese. Reporters crowded the benches, not because the accused were notorious criminals, but because the spectacle itself was irresistible. On trial were dock workers, small traders, and lorry drivers, ordinary men accused of extraordinary smuggling. They looked uncomfortable in their suits. fidgeting as prosecutors displayed photographs of cheese wheels stacked in warehouses, or customs officers holding confiscated cheddar like contraband treasure. The charges were no laughing matter. Though no violence was involved, the defendants faced accusations of tax evasion, smuggling, and participation in organized crime. The case, prosecutors argued, was not about food, it was about fairness, trust, and the integrity of Sweden's economic system. The prosecution's case. The state laid out its evidence meticulously. Seized shipments, tons of cheese confiscated in raids, matched to ferry manifests and truck logs. Wiretap conversations, in which suspects used coded phrases like yellow wheels and English cargo. Financial records showing sudden unexplained profits among men whose wages otherwise could not support their lifestyles. Prosecutors insisted this was not petty crime but organized smuggling, costing the government millions in lost tariffs. Cheese may seem harmless, one attorney declared, but unchecked, this trade undermines our farmers, our import laws, and our trust in borders. The defense's argument. Defense attorneys leaned into the absurdity. They mocked the idea that cheese could be treated like narcotics. Are we to believe, one lawyer asked, that Gouda is as dangerous as heroin? They portrayed their clients as working-class men simply trying to make ends meet, caught between inflated Swedish prices and consumer demand. They are not criminals, another lawyer argued. They are providers, supplying what ordinary people wanted but could not afford. The argument won some sympathy. After all, who hadn't bought cheaper goods across a border? Many Swedes quietly admitted they had tasted black market cheese without asking questions. The courtroom atmosphere. The trial stretched for weeks, alternating between serious testimony and moments of farce. Witnesses described smuggling cheese under nets of herring, or disguising it as frozen pork. Customs officers admitted somewhat sheepishly that they had trained dogs to sniff dairy. Journalists had a field day. Headlines dubbed the case the Gouda Gang trial and cheddar in the dock. Editorial cartoons showed smugglers in striped uniforms pushing giant cheese wheels up courthouse steps. Yet beneath the humor, there was a genuine unease. How had such an ordinary product become the center of a black market empire? The verdicts. When the verdicts finally came, they were mixed. The ringleaders, those who had orchestrated large-scale shipments and maintained distribution networks, received sentences of several years in prison. Smaller players, such as ferry passengers who had smuggled wheels for personal profit, were given fines or suspended sentences. The message was clear. Cheese smuggling was no longer to be treated as a harmless joke. It was a crime, and Sweden would enforce it. Public reaction. The verdict sparked debate. Some applauded the crackdown, arguing that the law must be upheld regardless of the product. If cheese can be smuggled unchecked, one editorial warned, what comes next? Others criticized the state for heavy-handedness. Prison for cheese, one letter to the newspaper scoffed. Surely our resources are better spent fighting real crime. The controversy revealed the blurred lines between necessity, greed, and absurdity in everyday crime. The government's response. In the wake of the scandal, Sweden adjusted its policies. Some tariffs were revised, quotas eased slightly, and import checks strengthened. The government sought a balance between protecting domestic dairy and preventing smuggling. The Customs Service also invested in better training and equipment, determined never again to be caught off guard by something as ordinary as cheese. The cultural legacy. Decades later, the Gothenburg cheese smuggling scandal lives on in Scandinavian memory as one of the strangest crime waves in modern history. It has been retold in newspaper retrospectives, academic studies, and even comedy sketches. To criminologists, it remains a case study in how crime flourishes where profit meets loophole. To ordinary people, It is a reminder that even the most mundane items can become illicit when systems distort supply and demand. And to those who lived through it, it was a period when every wheel of cheese carried the faint whiff of suspicion. Reflections. The cheese smugglers of Gothenburg did not see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as clever opportunists, exploiting price gaps and feeding demand. Yet in doing so, they disrupted markets, betrayed trust, and forced the government to treat dairy as though it were contraband gold. The story leaves us with a lingering question. When does bending the rules out of opportunity become organized crime? And how do societies decide which contraband matters most, whether it's guns, drugs, or simply wheels of cheese? Story 5. The Forgotten Bank Robbery of Umeå. When most people picture a bank robbery, they imagine masks, guns, and adrenaline, a desperate criminal shouting at tellers while sirens close in. But in the northern Swedish city of Umeå, one of the country's strangest robberies took place without a single shot, and for years, it barely registered in national memory. It happened quietly in the late 1980s, when Sweden was still a cash-heavy society and banks in smaller towns were not yet equipped with modern security systems. The robbers were not hardened gangsters, but ordinary men with a plan so cautious, so oddly slow, that it would later be remembered as one of the most uneventful robberies in Scandinavian history. And yet, their crime left a mark not because of violence, but because of how easy it was to walk into a bank, take the money, and nearly disappear into obscurity. Umeå in the 1980s. Umeå was a university town, nestled in northern Sweden, far from Stockholm's bustle. Known for its forests, cold winters, and cultural scene, it was not the kind of place people associated with high crime. Banks in the region were modest, serving farmers, students, and small businesses. Security was present but minimal. A few cameras, sometimes a guard, and heavy reliance on the assumption that no one would dare. That assumption would be tested in 1988, when a small group of men decided to rob a local branch in broad daylight without guns, without theatrics, and almost without anyone noticing. The planning. According to police records later pieced together, the robbers were not professionals. They were middle-aged, working-class men from the area, struggling financially during a period when Sweden's economy was tightening. Unemployment was rising, and credit was harder to come by. The plan they devised was almost shockingly simple. Observe the routine. They watched the bank for weeks, nodding when cash deliveries arrived, when tellers counted tills, and when security guards changed shifts. Pick the quietest time. They realized the bank was understaffed during mid-mornings, when most customers were at work. Exploit trust. Instead of storming in with masks, they would pose as ordinary customers, slipping behind the counter at the right moment. It was less a heist than an opportunistic act, fueled by desperation and the realization that the bank's defenses were fragile. The day of the robbery. It was a gray Thursday morning when they struck. Witnesses later said the men looked like anyone else, jackets zipped, hats pulled low against the cold. Inside, the bank was quiet. A few customers waited in line. Tellers counted money behind the glass. The men moved casually, splitting their roles. One distracted the staff with questions about a loan. Another slipped into a restricted area while a third acted as lookout. There were no raised voices, no weapons displayed. In fact, several customers didn't realize a robbery was happening until it was over. Within minutes, the men had filled bags with stacks of cash, tens of thousands of krona. They walked out calmly, blending into the ordinary foot traffic of downtown Umeå. No alarms blared. No chase ensued. The bank staff only realized the extent of the theft after the men were gone. The aftermath. When police arrived, they found a crime scene that looked almost mundane. No broken glass, no shell casings, no hostages traumatized. just missing money and baffled employees. Investigators were embarrassed. Sweden prided itself on orderliness, and the idea that a bank could be robbed so quietly, without resistance, seemed almost unthinkable. Reporters who covered the story noted how anticlimactic it felt compared to the sensational heists that made international headlines. It was, one journalist wrote, perhaps the politest bank robbery in Swedish history. A crime that slipped away. Despite the unusual nature of the robbery, the case quickly faded from the headlines. There were no dramatic shootouts or car chases to capture public imagination. Other stories, political scandals, economic troubles, cultural debates soon eclipsed it. But in Umeå, the robbery lingered in memory. Residents whispered about who the robbers might have been. Some suspected locals. Others believed it was outsiders passing through. Police launched an investigation, but with little forensic evidence and no eyewitnesses willing to swear to details, progress was slow. Leads dried up. Over time, the robbery was half forgotten. A strange footnote in Umeå's history, an event that seemed too uneventful to be a crime, yet had left a bank poorer and investigators empty-handed. Closing thought. The strangest thing about the Umeå bank robbery was not how much money was stolen, but how quietly it was done. No violence, no panic, just an ordinary day interrupted by men who decided to test the limits of trust. The question that haunted investigators was simple. How long could men so ordinary remain invisible in a small town where everyone thought they knew each other? When police in Umeå began piecing together the events of that quiet Thursday morning, they found themselves chasing ghosts. The robbery had been clean, almost too clean. No one remembered hearing shouts, seeing weapons, or even noticing the suspect's exit. Unlike cinematic heists, there were no dramatic fingerprints, no burning getaway cars, no abandoned masks in alleyways, just missing cash and an embarrassed staff left behind. For investigators, the robbery posed a peculiar problem. How do you solve a crime that barely made a sound? The first hours. In the immediate aftermath, officers cordoned off the bank, interviewing staff and customers. Descriptions of the robbers were vague, middle-aged, ordinary-looking, wearing jackets. One teller remembered that a man had asked about a loan just before the theft, but she couldn't describe his face clearly. Another customer thought he saw someone carrying a bag, but wasn't sure if it was suspicious or just a shopper leaving the bank. The lack of clarity was striking. Unlike violent robberies, where trauma sears details into memory, this theft had been so subdued that witnesses second-guessed themselves. Reviewing the cameras. The bank did have cameras, but the technology of the late 1980s was primitive. Grainy black and white footage showed men moving through the lobby, but their hats and jackets obscured their features. Investigators pored over the tapes, replaying the same blurred images again and again, hopping for a detail, a gait, a gesture, a recognizable piece of clothing. Nothing conclusive emerged. Theories emerged. With little physical evidence, police turned to theories. Local men. The robbers might have been from Umeå itself, familiar with the bank's routines and confident they could blend back into the town unnoticed. Outsiders. Others argued the thieves were travelers who struck opportunistically, vanishing on the next train south or the next flight out of Umeå airport. Inside help. A more troubling theory suggested an employee had assisted, tipping off the robbers about schedules and weaknesses. None of these theories gained enough evidence to stick. Following the money. The stolen cash was mostly in small bills, making it harder to trace. Serial numbers were recorded, but with Sweden's busy circulation of cash, they were nearly impossible to track once the money re-entered the economy. Police checked for sudden spending sprees in Umeå, hoping the robbers might reveal themselves through new cars or expensive habits. But no one stood out. If the thieves had taken the money back into the community, they had done so quietly. False leads. Over the next months, tips trickled in. A man in Sundsvall was arrested with a suspicious amount of cash, but it proved unrelated. A group of young men in Umeå bragged in a bar about knowing the robbers, but turned out to be bluffing for attention. One anonymous caller claimed the crime was linked to an organized gang in Stockholm, but no evidence supported the claim. Each lead fizzled, leaving investigators increasingly frustrated. The strain on police. For Umeå police, the case became a source of quiet embarrassment. Bank robberies elsewhere in Sweden occasionally ended in arrests, with dramatic stories of shootouts or captured fugitives. But here, in their quiet university town, the robbers had walked in and out almost unnoticed and remained free. Investigators rotated off the case. New officers reviewed the old files, but found little to work with. The robbery became less an active case and more a lingering question mark in the police archives. Community rumors. Meanwhile, rumors swirled in Umeå. Some claimed to know the culprits but kept silent out of loyalty. Others whispered that the money had been hidden in forest cabins, waiting for the statute of limitations to expire. In cafes and pubs, the story was retold half seriously, as if it were more of a local legend than a crime. "Do you remember the robbery?" someone would ask, and heads would nod, with theories offered but no consensus reached. The nature of the crime. What baffled criminologists later was not only how the robbery was carried out, but why it faded so quickly from public consciousness. Most bank robberies make headlines because they involve danger, violence, or daring escapes. But this one, carried out almost politely, lacked the drama that would have cemented it in national memory. Instead, it became what some called the invisible robbery, a crime too quiet to demand outrage, but too successful to be ignored entirely. Closing thought. For police, the central frustration was this. Crimes are usually solved by mistakes, by slips of the tongue, by evidence left behind in haste. But the Umeå robbers made no such mistakes, or at least, none that investigators ever found. Which left one haunting question. Had the men simply melted back into ordinary life, their crime forgotten even as they lived among the very neighbors they had deceived? Years after the quiet robbery of Umeå's bank branch, the case had become less of an investigation and more of a shadow in the police archives. It sat in a folder marked unsolved, occasionally dusted off when new officers trained or when journalists looking for forgotten stories asked questions. But for the most part, it was a case swallowed by silence. No suspects were ever arrested. No confessions surfaced. The stolen money never reappeared in any form investigators could trace. The men who had walked calmly into a bank and taken its cash seemed to have vanished back into ordinary life, leaving behind only questions. The statute of limitations. In Sweden, the law places limits on how long certain crimes can be prosecuted. By the mid-1990s, the statute of limitations for the Umeå robbery expired. Whatever names police might have scribbled in the margins of their reports could never be formally charged. The expiration marked an official end to the case, but unofficially, it sparked renewed speculation. Did the robbers know about the statute and plan to lay low until they were safe? Had they buried the money, waiting patiently until it could be spent without fear? For locals, the thought that the thieves might still be living among them neighbors, colleagues, perhaps even quiet retirees was both unsettling and oddly thrilling. The journalistic rediscovery. In the early 2000s, a regional newspaper ran a retrospective on forgotten crimes of Västerbotten County. The Umeå bank robbery featured prominently. Reporters interviewed retired officers who admitted their frustration at the time. "It wasn't that we didn't care," one said. "It's that we had nothing to hold on to. It was like chasing smoke." Former bank staff, older now, remembered the embarrassment of working in a branch that had been robbed so quietly. We weren't traumatized, one teller admitted. We were just baffled. It was like the money evaporated. The article reignited local interest, sparking conversations in cafes once again. Who were the robbers? Were they local? Had they grown old with their secret intact? The psychology of the robbery. Criminologists who later studied the case noted its peculiarity. Unlike violent bank heists, which often end with arrests, the Umeå robbery demonstrated a different principle, that sometimes the quietest crimes are the hardest to solve. The robbers exploited trust and routine, not guns or threats. They blended into ordinary life, relying on the invisibility of normalcy. In doing so, they exposed a vulnerability in security systems that assumed criminals must be dramatic to be dangerous. It was, in essence, a crime of patience and understatement. The victim's perspective. For the bank itself, the loss was financial and reputational. Insurance eventually covered much of the stolen money, but the embarrassment lingered. Management tightened procedures, added more cameras, and improved guard schedules. For the community, the robbery became a kind of ghost story. Few people were directly harmed, no one was injured, no hostages taken. But there was a lingering unease. If criminals could simply walk into a bank and walk out richer, what else could slip unnoticed past the fabric of trust? The suspect who never surfaced. Privately, police officers admitted they had a short list of names, men known for petty crime in Umeå, men with debts, men who suddenly seemed more comfortable financially. But none of the suspicions ever hardened into evidence. One retired detective confessed in an interview, "I'm almost certain we knew who they were, but knowing isn't enough. Without proof, it's just gossip." And so the names remained unspoken in public, whispered only in private circles, fading as the years passed. The fading memory. By the 2010s, the robbery was rarely mentioned outside of local history talks or newspaper curiosities. Younger generations in Umeå barely knew it had happened. For them, it was just one more anecdote about the city's past, overshadowed by larger events. But for those who remembered, the robbery symbolized something more than stolen money. It was a reminder that even in a society built on order and trust, small ruptures could appear. That sometimes the most effective crimes were not loud but quiet, not violent but subtle. The legacy. The forgotten bank robbery of Umeå left no dramatic scars. No lives were lost, no national headlines carved its story into collective memory. But in its quiet way, it shaped policy. Security in small-town banks was tightened. Cash handling procedures grew stricter. Staff were trained to be alert not just to violence, but to subtle distractions and movements. And in criminology circles, the case became an example of how the absence of drama can itself be a criminal tactic. Closing reflection. Perhaps the most haunting element of the Umeå robbery is the thought that the men responsible may have lived the rest of their lives as ordinary citizens, fathers, workers, neighbors, carrying with them the secret of one quiet morning when they stepped out of normal life and into history. The money is gone. The statute of limitations has expired. The case is closed. And yet one question lingers. How many crimes lie forgotten, not because they were unsolvable, but because they were too quiet to leave a trace? Story 6. The Counterfeit Lottery of Bergen. Lotteries promise hope wrapped in paper. One ticket, one chance, and perhaps the weight of ordinary life can be lifted by sudden fortune. In Bergen, Norway, during the late 1970s, hope came in the form of colorful printed slips sold in kiosks, cafes, and tobacco shops. Each week, thousands of people handed over a few krona for the dream of striking it rich. But for months, a quiet fraud seeped into this system so subtle that it took time for anyone to notice. Some tickets weren't what they seemed. They looked genuine, carried the right logos, bore the right numbers. Yet when winners came forward, confusion spread. Their lucky tickets, it turned out, were worthless counterfeits. This was the story of Bergen's counterfeit lottery, scheme, a crime that blended greed, trust, and the vulnerabilities of a system built on dreams. Bergen in the 1970s. The city of Bergen was a bustling port town, proud of its maritime history and cultural scene. Yet, like much of Norway in the 1970s, it also bore the strains of economic change. Inflation rose, wages struggled to keep up, and people longed for shortcuts to prosperity. The national lottery, operated by Norsk Tipping, became a popular outlet for those hopes. Tickets were affordable, widely available, and carried the legitimacy of a state-run system. Winning the lottery was a long shot, but it was a dream everyone could buy into. And dreams, as the counterfeiters discovered, were easy to exploit. The first cracks appear. The fraud first came to light in 1978 when a man stepped into a kiosk to check his numbers. His ticket, purchased weeks earlier, matched a small prize. The kiosk clerk congratulated him but noticed something odd. The paper felt slightly off, thinner than usual. Unsure, she sent the ticket to Norsk Tipping's office in Oslo for verification. The answer came back: the ticket was fake. At first, officials thought it was an isolated incident, perhaps a printing error or a one-off forgery. But soon, more cases surfaced. People presented tickets that looked real but failed validation. The paper stock was subtly wrong, the ink faintly different, the serial numbers mismatched. Whispers spread. Someone was producing counterfeit lottery tickets and flooding Bergen streets with them. The mechanics of the fraud. Investigators began piecing together how the scheme worked. Genuine lottery tickets were printed under secure conditions, with serial numbers and coded validation marks. Counterfeiters had managed to imitate the design with surprising accuracy, using commercial printing equipment. The fakes were good enough to fool most buyers and even some clerks. Only when tickets were submitted for prizes did the fraud become visible. The brilliance of the scheme lay in its scale. Most fake tickets, of course, didn't win anything. Buyers who lost assumed they were simply unlucky and tossed the slips away. The counterfeiters profited not by cashing in prizes, but by selling worthless paper to hopeful customers, pocketing real money in return. It was theft disguised as chance. The victims. The victims were ordinary people: dockworkers, shop clerks, students, pensioners, anyone who bought a ticket from a kiosk in Bergen. A retired fisherman recalled his anger years later. "I didn't expect to win, but I expected my ticket to be real. When I heard some were fake, I realized I had been cheated even of my chance." For many, the crime stung not because of the money lost, often just a few krona, but because of the betrayal. The lottery represented trust, the promise that everyone had an equal shot at fortune. Counterfeits shattered that illusion. Investigators close in. As reports mounted, Norwegian police and officials from Norsk Tipping launched a joint investigation. They traced the counterfeit tickets back to specific kiosks, many of them clustered in central Bergen. Shop owners, furious at being implicated, insisted they had no idea. The tickets had come from distributors, middlemen who supplied legitimate stock, but had apparently slipped counterfeits into the mix. The challenge for investigators was distinguishing real from fake in a sea of paper. Counterfeits were skillful, and only forensic analysis of ink, paper, and numbering could separate them. The human side. Behind the technical investigation, there was also a cultural shock. Norwegians prided themselves on honesty and trustworthiness. The idea that someone in Bergen had exploited the national lottery, a system seen as almost sacred, was deeply unsettling. People began eyeing their tickets suspiciously, wondering if their hope had been sold to them as a lie. Kiosk clerks faced angry customers. Norsk Tipping scrambled to reassure the public that most tickets were genuine. The scandal was not just about money, it was about faith in a national institution. Closing thought. By early 1979, Investigators had narrowed their focus to a handful of suspects: printers, distributors, and opportunists with access to machinery and designs. But one question loomed over the case: who had the audacity and the skill to counterfeit dreams in the form of lottery slips? By early 1979, the investigation into Bergen's counterfeit lottery tickets had grown into one of Norway's strangest financial crime cases. The fraud was clever, pervasive, and oddly intimate. It didn't just cheat banks or businesses, but individual dreams. The key to unraveling the mystery lay not only in the paper slips themselves, but in understanding the men who dared to counterfeit luck. Following the paper trail, the forensic team at Norsk Tipping began comparing seized counterfeit tickets to genuine ones. At first glance, the copies were impressive. Fonts matched, logos were accurate, and colors nearly identical. But under magnification, flaws emerged. Ink inconsistency. The counterfeiters had used cheaper ink, which bled slightly into the paper fibers. Serial errors. Genuine tickets followed a precise numbering system. The fakes sometimes repeated numbers or skipped ranges entirely. Paper stock. Norsk Tipping used a particular heavy-grade paper with faint watermarks. The counterfeit tickets lacked these, though most buyers never noticed. By tracing which kiosks had unknowingly sold the most counterfeit slips, police narrowed the circle. Several distributors were questioned, and soon, a pattern pointed toward a small printing business operating on the outskirts of Bergen. The printer. The shop in question had been founded by two brothers, skilled in commercial printing. Officially, they produced flyers, business cards, and pamphlets for local clients. But investigators suspected they had quietly expanded into more profitable ventures. A raid on the print shop confirmed the suspicion. Hidden beneath stacks of legitimate orders, police found plates etched with lottery ticket designs, stacks of counterfeit tickets, and invoices with suspiciously vague entries. The brothers were arrested, along with two associates who had helped distribute the fakes to kiosks. The suspects. The accused were not hardened criminals. They were ordinary men in their 30s and 40s, struggling with debts and tempted by the easy profit of counterfeit tickets. In interrogation, one of the brothers admitted they had been inspired by the simplicity of the system. "We realized most tickets never win," he explained. "So why not sell fake ones? People throw them away anyway." It was a startlingly cynical logic. That because most buyers lost, selling them worthless tickets was almost the same as selling them genuine ones. Community shock. When news of the arrests broke, Bergen was stunned. The counterfeiters were not shadowy figures but locals with families, neighbors who had sat in cafes and strolled the same streets as their victims. For many residents, the betrayal felt personal. "It wasn't about the money," one pensioner said bitterly. "It was about trust. We believed the lottery was fair. They made it a joke." The investigation expands. Police soon realized the fraud had extended beyond Bergen. Counterfeit tickets had surfaced in neighboring towns, suggesting the network was larger than first believed. Interviews revealed that some distributors had been unwitting middlemen, while others had looked the other way, pocketing extra profit from the sales. The case grew into a tangled web of complicity, stretching across western Norway. Officials at Norsk Tipping scrambled to reassure the public, launching campaigns to emphasize the security of genuine tickets. They added new verification measures, holograms, improved numbering, and tighter control over distribution. The psychology of counterfeiting luck. Criminologists later studied the case as an example of psychological exploitation. The counterfeiters hadn't just stolen money, they had stolen hope. Lottery tickets are more than paper, they are vessels of imagination. For a few days, a buyer can dream of winning, of escape from routine. By counterfeiting those slips, the fraudsters poison that dream, replacing possibility with deception. Some scholars compared it to counterfeiting currency, but with an emotional twist. When you forge a lottery ticket, one wrote, you aren't just stealing money, you're stealing belief in chance itself. A strange dilemma. Legally, the case presented an unusual challenge. Many counterfeit tickets were sold to people who never would have one anyway. If a fake ticket's numbers didn't match the draw, had the buyer really lost more than the few krona spent? Prosecutors argued firmly that the crime was still fraud. Every ticket carried the promise of legitimacy, one prosecutor said. By selling fakes, they stole not only money but faith in a system. Still, the philosophical question lingered. Can you steal something as intangible as hope? Closing thought. As the trial approached, Bergen buzzed with speculation. Would the counterfeiters face harsh punishment, or would the court treat it as a strange footnote in Norway's crime history? And beneath that question lay another. How many counterfeit tickets still sat tucked in drawers or boxes, waiting to be discovered years later by someone who once believed they held a chance at fortune? By the spring of 1979, Bergen's counterfeit lottery scandal had reached its climax. The arrests of the printing brothers and their associates had already stunned the city, but now the trial promised to expose the full scale of the scheme. Courtrooms in Norway are not known for theatrics, yet the atmosphere in Bergen's district court was charged. Journalists packed the benches, eager to report on a case that seemed both absurd and unsettling. After all, the defendants weren't accused of robbing banks or smuggling drugs, they were accused of counterfeiting dreams, of forging fortune itself. The prosecution's case. The state presented its evidence with painstaking detail. Printing plates seized from the brothers' shop, showing exact replicas of Norsk tipping tickets. Stacks of counterfeit slips, bundled in boxes, ready for distribution. Financial records, revealing sudden income that far exceeded the print shop's legitimate business. Witness testimony from kiosk owners and distributors, some complicit, others deceived. Prosecutors argued that the counterfeiters had deliberately eroded trust in one of Norway's most cherished institutions. This was not a prank, one attorney declared. This was fraud against the people. Every ticket sold carried a promise, and these men sold lies. The defense's strategy. The defense tried a different tack. Their clients, they argued, had not truly harmed anyone. Most lottery tickets do not win, one lawyer reminded the court. Whether a person bought a real ticket or a counterfeit one, their chances were always vanishingly small. It was a startlingly pragmatic argument, that because luck is rare, defrauding the unlucky was almost harmless. The courtroom bristled. For victims, the statement stung. Losing fairly was one thing, being cheated before the draw even happened was another. Witnesses speak. Ordinary citizens testified, their voices bringing the crime back down to earth. A pensioner described spending part of his meager savings on tickets, only to discover later that they might have been worthless. A young mother recalled the thrill of thinking she had won a small prize, followed by humiliation when the ticket was rejected. Their stories reinforced what the prosecution insisted, that the crime wasn't about krona and ore, but about trust. The verdict. After weeks of hearings, the judges delivered their verdicts. The brothers, as ringleaders and printers, were sentenced to several years in prison. Their associates, who had distributed the tickets, received lighter sentences, fines, suspended terms, and in some cases short prison stays. Kiosk owners who had knowingly sold fakes faced penalties as well, though most were cleared as unwitting participants. The court emphasized that the crime struck at the foundation of public trust. When chance itself is corrupted, the ruling read, the community is cheated not only of money but of faith. Public reaction. The sentences were met with mixed reactions. Some applauded the harshness, insisting that deterrence was necessary to protect the lottery system. Others scoffed, seeing it as overblown punishment for what they called a crime of paper. But beneath the debate, a deeper shift occurred. People began to view lotteries with new caution. For a time, ticket sales dipped. Norsk Tipping had to work hard to reassure the public that safeguards were now in place. Changes to the system. The scandal forced significant reforms. Improved printing security. Genuine tickets were printed with holograms, better watermarks, and unique validation codes. Tighter distribution. Middlemen were eliminated, with direct supply chains from Norsk Tipping to kiosks. Verification systems. New machines allowed clerks to instantly verify tickets, reducing the chance of fake slips slipping through. These changes echoed through the following decades, shaping how lotteries in Norway and beyond handled security. The legacy. Today, the counterfeit lottery of Bergen is remembered less for the money lost than for what it symbolized. How even in a society that prided itself on fairness, trust could be quietly betrayed. For Bergen residents who lived through it, the scandal became a story told with a mix of bitterness and disbelief. We weren't robbed with guns, one man reflected years later. We were robbed with paper and ink. Criminologists continue to cite the case as an example of psychological crime fraud that targets hope itself, turning the most optimistic impulse into a point of exploitation.